If you care about your poker win rate, do not make the mistake that I see over 90% of poker players making. And it's happening in the area of poker, which is where you spend the most of your time. And that would be not paying attention when you are not in a hand. A lot of people will say, duh, I know to pay attention when I'm not in a hand, but often they don't know the right things to look for. Then there are people that say, yeah, I know it's important to do so, but I'm just not able to. It's so boring and I can't stay engaged. So in this video, I'm going to provide two types of tips to you. I'm going to tell you what to look for when you're not in a hand, and I'm going to give you the practical tips to actually stay engaged enough to be able to do so. And if you follow this, it will improve your win rate dramatically. But first, we need to understand the nature of the beast, which is that we live in a world with constant distractions. And in the casino, this is amplified. So let's talk about all the things that are there to hijack your attention. First, the smartphone. The smartphone is designed to take you away from the present moment and to fixate your attention on whatever little app you're looking at. Some of the very smartest people in the world are actively working to hijack your attention and to bring it onto their app in your smartphone and take you away from whatever you were supposed to be looking at the poker table. So be mindful of that. In addition, the casino has many other distractions like slot machines, which are actively making noise or blinking. There's sports betting going on all the time and whatever else is on the TV. And of course, there's table conversation and there's gossip. And the number one distraction may be what is coming through your own mind in terms of thought and emotion and dwelling on past hands or past events that have happened. All of this is taking you away from being able to follow the action. So what to do about this? All is not lost. Once you know where to look and how to actually stay engaged, you will be able to overcome some of these things. Now, with that said, I'm human and I get caught up in a lot of the noise as well, and you're probably never going to be able to block out all the noise. You also want to be able to create a fun and engaging atmosphere for other people that are playing with you. So you don't just want to have your headphones in and block it all out and be like 100% focused on just the action, not talking to anybody and not creating a fun social dynamic. But there is a balance to this. And if you're able to still maintain an engaging environment, but follow the action in the ways that I'm about to describe, you're going to experience the results that you want. So let's start with how to actually do this, which is number one, a really helpful tip to help you stay engaged in more of an active type of mindset is to mentally narrate the action to yourself as it's happening. So it can be helpful to say, something along the lines of like, under the gun 2 opens, hijack calls, big blind calls, 90 in the pot, we see a flop, the flop is X, Y, and Z, and just keep kind of a running commentary in your head about what's actually happening. This will help you stay engaged in more of an active frame and allow you to not, drift off into one of the many, many distractions that we mentioned previously. Another thing you can do to stay engaged is to actively take notes as you are going. So you can take notes about various players, you can take notes about things or patterns that you're noticing as the game is progressing. And one thing we've learned about note-taking is that a lot of people think, well, I have a certain learning style. I'm either a visual learner or auditory or I'm kinesthetic. And extensive studies have been done showing that this is actually a myth. And it's more common that just having multiple modalities of learning helps you absorb information better, no matter what type of learner you are. So what I mean by that is even if you're a visual learner, it still helps to write things down and have another modality to capture that information. Even if you're auditory and you like to listen to what the players are saying at the table, having that other means of like typing into a notepad app of like what I just observed or what I saw from X, Y, and Z player will help the information stick with you better, even if you never ever go back and read it over and review it later. It's just keeping you more in the present moment now. A third tip to help you stay engaged is to give your mind a conscious focus for what to look for. So there are a couple really good ones at the table. One of them would be to look at the hands of your opponent. I don't mean the cards, I mean the physical 5-finger hands that your opponents have as you're watching. And it's a source of a lot of tells in poker. There have been a lot of studies that have shown that the poker face is actually highly misleading in terms of the information that it gives you. We saw this in a study done by Blake Eastman. He was actually just interviewed by Jungleman on his podcast, and he basically looked at 550,000 poker player blinks and what that was able to tell them about facial features. And after doing all that work, they basically found that people who look at this type of thing are doing no better than someone just guessing randomly in terms of the poker face. However, the hands are very revealing in terms of what they can tell us about a player's hand strength. The same thing was found in a Michael Slepian study, where he's now a Columbia professor, and a number of his colleagues found, after looking at thousands and thousands of clips of WSOP hands, that poker faces are very, very misleading. The hands, though, when they paid attention to those, that tended to lead to much better predictions and assessments of hand strength. And what we're looking for is just kind of fluidity of motion. Does the player seem confident as he's putting his chips in, not just in what he's saying or the way his face looks, which can be actively distorted, but how does his hand motion look as he's doing it? And just kind of give your mind that focus as you're looking across the table, giving it that conscious focus over and over to redirect back to something that's happening in game. Even if you're not picking up something right away, it can help you stay anchored in the moment and not get caught up in all the distractions. Another thing you can do to stay anchored is to pay attention to the pot size and just track how big is the pot getting, what are the betting multiples of the players, and see if any patterns start to emerge. Like whenever this player bets half, 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 he always has it, and it's kind of like his milky value betting size, compared to if he bets like 1/3 and then sizes up and then sizes up again. Maybe the player, hypothetically is more bluff heavy in those lines. But you're never going to know it if you aren't tracking the pot and you aren't mentally keeping track of what types of multiples this player is using. So these are all ways to help us stay engaged. Now, what about the specific things to look for pre-flop and post-flop? So if we know what to look for, our brains are very, very good at finding it. And that's why knowing ahead of time, like I'm going to lay out for you some of the key tips to look for, this is going to help us stay engaged in the moment and actually pay attention when we're not in a hand. So pre-flop, some of the biggest things to look for are just, of course, how wide of a range are your opponents playing? So pay attention to, are they wide when they open? Are they wide when they call from various spots? Do they have wide or tight 3-betting ranges? Most players will have tight 4-betting ranges, but pay attention to, can their 4-bet range even have bluffs in it? Or is it always kings and aces? So getting a sense of the general ranges your opponents are playing, also keeping track of, do they like to defend their big blind or not? This is especially important in tournaments where stealing those blinds is going to be your lifeblood in those later stages. But even in cash games, just being able to run over very tight players in the blinds and constantly make that dead money without paying rake is a big source of profit, and it allows you to open wider when there are tight players in the blinds. We're also going to pay attention to what type of 3-bet range and 4-bet ranges our opponents like to use. Some players, when they 3-bet you, they will be what's called a polar range. It'll consist of very strong hands like, say, jacks or better, and ace king, maybe ace queen suited, and then some bluffs, like maybe they'll use like a suited ace, like an ace 3 suited, an ace 5 suited, a suited connector. So this type of player is 3-betting you more polar because they have some very strong hands and some weaker hands. The player that's 3-betting linear will tend to be just 3-betting you with the very strongest hands in his range. So he might 3-bet you with more pocket 10s, pocket 9s, maybe some pocket 8s, ace jack suited, king queen suited, ace 10 suited. So like the pretty good but not great hands, he's using those as 3-bets compared to the player who's polar and is using those hands in the middle more as a call. So just keeping in mind, is this player polar when he 3-bets me, or is he linear? You're going to get all of that information by watching the showdowns of what's going on in hands that you are not in. If you are checked out, if you're sports betting, if you're gossiping with your neighbor or caught up in some other, BS that's going on in the casino, you're going to miss this valuable information and you're not going to find the right adjustments. Post flop, there's even more things we can pay attention to because it's 3 streets and there's a lot more depth and complexity. So post flop, some of the most important things to look for are, do my opponents actually like to bluff catch? If they do, you probably shouldn't be trying to get them off top pair on the river and going for triple barrel lines as a bluff. Compare that to an opponent who does not like to bluff catch. Now that very situational top pair is something that he will more often fold, and you can find more bluffs against this type of player. Compare that to, does the opponent like to run big bluffs? Some people just won't bluff once the dollar amount gets above a certain level, and you can fold all of your bluff catchers to them. Compared to a player that is willing to do that, you observe them doing that in a hand that you were paying attention to. Now you can find that hero call, whereas before you really couldn't have if you weren't paying attention. It's also helpful to note what type of check raiser is this player. If he's a very active check raiser, well, that limits the frequency that we can see bet against him because he's going to punish a lot of the things in the middle of our range when we see bet. If he's not an aggressive check raiser, if he's very passive and he likes to slow play, that allows us to see bet more hands and not be punished because we get to realize our equity more frequently and draw out more. It's also helpful to look for how does our opponent like to play his draws. Some players are very passive with draws, even very strong combo draws, and their raises will tend to be from made hands that want protection, while others, they really like to shovel in a ton of money with these hands. It's fun because, you have high equity, there's a gambling component to it, you get to make your opponent fold made hands, and so that's part of the mindset of other players. It also helps them balance their value hands more to have these high equity draws in their check raising and raising ranges. So pay attention to, do they like to play their draws aggressively? And how do they treat showdown value? This is a huge one to look for post flop. So is my opponent somebody who, once he makes a pair, he's never going to turn it into a bluff because he has quote unquote showdown value and he wants to show it down? Once you know this type of thing, it can help you find folds in spots where the opponent is almost certainly going to have a pair on this board the way the action ran out. And so when he puts a big amount of money into the pot, it's not being done with air anymore, and you can find some big folds against him, compared to the guy who actually is savvy enough to turn a pair into a bluff, especially if it's a weak pair and he senses that you have a better hand than him. We need to be more careful against this player and potentially find some bluff catches, even when his range has no technical air in it. A few other things to pay attention to post flop. Does my opponent like to continuation bet? And if so, does he like to use a polar range or a linear range? A polar range would mean, again, that he's c-betting the very strongest hands like good top pair or better, or he's c-betting air and various bluffs. The guy who's c-betting more of a linear range, more of a merged range, is using things like middle pair, weak pair, stuff that has some showdown value, but is not like either very strong or very weak. And so we're going to treat those players very, very differently. The guy who's betting very polar against us, we're going to check raise him less because we make his life pretty easy if he's c-betting polar. Now all of a sudden, if we check raise, he only gets to continue with the very strong hands. He folds the weak hands. We're not really punishing anything in his range once he c-bets. Compare that to the guy who's like linear betting 1/3 with his whole range. Now all of a sudden the check raise really punishes a lot of those hands in the middle of his range that don't want to face greater pressure. We also want to be on the lookout for the types of betting patterns an opponent has. Some opponents are as straightforward as bet size equals hand strength. They're just betting whatever the strength of their hand is, and you can read into like small bet means small hand. Big bet means I better fold my bluff catchers. Other opponents are opposites players, and it's completely reversed in that regard. So we're going to call more against the big bets. We're going to fold more against the milky small bets. But just getting a sense of the general betting strategy that they're using. Other players are GTO-like players. So they're going to use like a bet size for their entire range. And we're not going to get as much information from that range. It's going to be harder to exploit. So against these players, we want to potentially steer them into game lines that they're less familiar with because they're going to be so booked up on the main lines that's going to be hard to exploit them in this regard. So just getting a sense of what type of strategy opponent is using. Another type of opponent that's very tricky is they're basically using a bet size to accomplish whatever they're looking to do in the hand. So we just want to get a sense of what is it they're trying to accomplish. Are they trying to get value? Are they trying to fold out our hand on this given board texture? And just notice what size they're using and whether it makes sense as a value bet or a bluff, and then do the opposite of what they want. All of this information goes into building player profiles that you will not be able to build if you're not paying attention in the hand. Some of the most common profiles we will build will be things like noticing that a player is very, very tight and passive, or noticing that he's tight and aggressive, or loose and passive, or loose and aggressive. Just having this type of player profile gathered through hands over time that we've observed will help us make the very, very best decisions against our opponents. So if there's one thing I could stress through all of this and the importance of paying attention in the hands amidst the many, many distractions that are going on in a casino environment, it's that poker is very often won in these moments of inactivity, in the moments where you're not in the hand, but you gather something that can be used in a future hand that you play in, or even if you can't use it that day, in a later session against this opponent that can make you money in the future. It's not the sexiest aspect of poker. Many people check out during this time, but even if you're not perfect at it, just doing a little bit better than your opponents with information from this video will help you dramatically boost your win rate. I hope you liked this content, and if you did, please subscribe for more videos just like this.